A Voice from Waterloo is the humble tale of an old soldier who was an eyewitness to, and participant in, many of the scenes he attempts to describe. Edward Cotton served in the 7th Hussars. The battle is in full swing. Let's begin. The 95th Rifles were soon in the midst of the broken French infantry, over which the two cavalries had ridden. They took a vast number of prisoners and sent them to the rear. The Rifles then reoccupied the knoll and sand pit, and Baring's gallant Germans the little garden and orchard of La Haye Sainte, from whence the enemy had been driven. Ponsonby's brigade had advanced close up to the ridge, and was waiting for the proper moment to charge, for the French columns on Kemp's left, having had nothing in their front to check them after Byland retreated, were making through the hedges that lined the road. Part of the Royal Dragoons dashed into the head of the enemy's column in their front, and at the same moment a portion of the 28th Regiment brought their right shoulders forward and fired a volley into its left flank. At this time, part of Pack's brigade, formed of the redoubtable remains of the 92nd Highlanders, was in the rear of the ridge, their left brought forward, resting in front of the brushwood upon the knoll on our left. Part of another French column had passed the straggling hedge and were pressing on towards the position of this brigade, bearing directly on its left. This handful of tried soldiers, partially aided by the Royal Scots and 42nd Highlanders, immediately advanced in order to come to close quarters with the enemy, whose fire they received without returning, until within 30 yards. They then threw in a concentrated and destructive volley, which completely staggered the French, who however soon sufficiently recovered themselves to return the fire. At this moment, the Scots Greys came up, and the Highlanders opened out to let them pass. The wild shrill squeaking bagpipes, mixed with the shouting of Scotland forever, heightened the national enthusiasm, and many of them, breaking from their ranks, caught hold of the Greys' stirrups to be able to keep up with them, and to take their part in completing the destruction of the enemy. Where streamed fair Scotia's banners high, or nodded where her bonnets blew, where pealed the bagpipes' deafening cry, or where the varied tartans flew, there did the rush of battle burst, blazing the deadly fight begun. There did the shouts of triumph first, proclaimed the Gallic host undone. While we see in this fact ample proof of the ardour which fired the breasts of our brave Scottish troops, yet we must allow that the mingling of broken infantry with cavalry advancing to an attack must have materially impeded the impetus and efficiency of both. The cavalry, having the advantage of the descent, bore down all before them. Unfortunately, this splendid result was not enough for the gallant spirits that achieved it. Wild with their success and carried away by the ardour of the fight, they hurried in utter confusion up the opposite slopes, sabring every living thing that came in their way. This was not the only instance of our cavalry getting disordered and out of hand by their own headlong rashness, and in consequence causing the most serious loss of life. The eagle and colour of the 45th Regiment in the French column attracted the particular attention of Sergeant Ewart of the Greys. He gallantly rushed forward to secure the trophy. The following is his account of the affair. It was in the charge I took the eagle from the enemy. He and I had a hard contest for it. He made a thrust at my groin, I parried it off and cut him down through the head. After this, a lancer came at me. I threw the lance off by my right side, and cut him through the chin and upwards through the teeth. Next, a foot soldier fired at me, and then charged me with his bayonet, which I also had the good luck to parry, and then I cut him down through the head. Thus ended the contest. As I was about to follow my regiment, the general said, "My brave fellow, take that to the rear, you have done enough till you get quit of it." I took the eagle to the ridge, and afterwards to Brussels. The Greys, with the Highlanders, took and destroyed nearly the whole of the front attacking column. Upon the right of the Greys were the Inniskilling Dragoons, who dashed through the straggling hedge down upon the supporting columns, and made fearful havoc amongst them, and although they had not the good fortune to capture an eagle, their attack was as brilliant as that of the other regiments of the brigade. On the right of the brigade were the Royal Dragoons, as before mentioned, who, like the Greys, met the head of the enemy's column on our side of the Wavre road and hedge. The column threw out a straggling fire, and attempted to repass the hedge, but the Royals were soon among them, cutting and slashing away, and causing a panic, which, from the enemy's situation, was not to be wondered at. In the centre of this column was the eagle of the 105th Regiment. This caught the eye of Captain Clark, of the Royal Dragoons. The following extract is from the records of the regiment. "I was," he said, "in command of the centre squadron of the Royal Dragoons in this charge. While following up the attack, I perceived a little to my left, in the midst of a body of infantry, an eagle and colour, which the bearer was making off with towards the rear. I immediately gave the order to my squadron, right shoulders forward. At the same time leading direct upon the eagle and calling out to the men with me to secure the colour. The instant I got within reach of the officer who carried the eagle, I ran my sword into his right side, and he staggered and fell, but did not reach the ground on account of the pressure of his companions. As the officer was in the act of falling, I called out a second time to some men close behind me, Secure the colour, it belongs to me. The standard coverer, Corporal Styles, and several other men rushed up, and the eagle fell across my horse's head against that of Corporal Styles's. As it was falling, I caught the fringe of the flag with my left hand but could not at first pull up the eagle. At the second attempt, however, I succeeded. Being in the midst of French troops, I attempted to separate the eagle from the staff, to put it into the breast of my coatee, but it was too firmly fixed. Corporal Styles said, "Sir, don't break it," to which I replied, "Very well, carry it off to the rear as fast as you can." He did so. Though wounded, I preferred remaining on the field in command of my squadron, which I did till near 7 o'clock in the evening, when I was obliged to withdraw, having had 2 horses killed under me, and having received 2 wounds, which confined me to my quarters at Brussels for nearly 2 months. During this conflict, the valley and slopes of both positions presented a sight indeed. They were covered with broken troops of both armies, ours, both infantry and cavalry, bringing up prisoners singly and in groups. Some few of our fellows, until driven back by their officers, were helping themselves to any little valuable article they could lay hand on. Many French officers were brought up prisoners. They delivered up their swords to our officers. The enemy upon the opposite heights was similarly employed in taking prisoners and destroying such of our cavalry as had ventured too far, particularly the Scots Greys, who by their ill-timed impetuosity, lost many men and horses. In fact, most of Ponsonby's brigade, with a portion of the Household Brigade, animated by their first success, pursued their advantage too far. They crossed the valley in disorder and galloped up to the French position in 2s and 3s and groups, brandishing their swords in defiance, riding along the ridge, sabering the gunners, and rendering about 30 guns useless. The bugles, or trumpets, sounding to rally, were unheeded. General Ponsonby rode forward to stop their wild career, but he was intercepted in a ploughed field by the Lancers, and killed. The command of the brigade devolved on Colonel Muta, of the Inniskillings. The enemy's cuirassiers, Lancers, and chasseurs, perceiving the isolated and unsupported position of our broken dragoons, rushed forward and made serious havoc, pursuing them down the slope into the valley. Those of our men whose horses were blown and exhausted by their recent exertions, became an easy prey to the enemy, but at length, the 12th and 16th Light Dragoons, part of Vandelor's brigade, came forward. The 12th, under Colonel F. Ponsonby, charged some unsteady infantry in the valley, and then attacked the Lancers, whom they overpowered, thus relieving our broken cavalry. In advancing, the 12th suffered most severely from the fire of some of Durut's division, who were concealed by a high bank in the valley, in front of our left. The 16th Light Dragoons charged some of the enemy's cavalry. Part of Merle's Dutch-Belgian cavalry came up as a support. A portion went down the slope. Vivian's brigade moved from our extreme left towards the scene of action, but like Merle's, it was not required. Both sides were now employed in reforming upon their original positions, except our 2 light cavalry brigades, which took position somewhat more to their right. The skeleton remains of Ponsonby's brigade, at a later period of the day, crossed the Charleroi road and joined Lord Edward Somerset's. Meanwhile our rockets were playing with destructive effect upon the enemy, who were rallying opposite to our left. After this sanguinary conflict, Napoleon rode along his right wing, and as usual, he was loudly cheered. Sir Hussey Vivian, who at the time was in front of the knoll on our left, told me that he distinctly saw the Emperor. He was galloping towards some of his lancers that were reforming. Upon the near approach of Napoleon they waved their lance flags and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" Shortly before this, Vivian ordered 2 of Major Gardiner's guns which were attached to his brigade to open fire. Upon this, a French artillery opened, and a shot striking one of our ammunition tumbrils, it blew up, which called forth a shout from the French gunners. We may remark upon this attack, which the Duke pronounced the most serious that occurred during the day, that it was entirely defeated, that it gave us a great many prisoners, led to our disabling many of their guns, and that its failure frustrated Napoleon's entire plan. Nor can any doubt be entertained, that if Wellington's forces on this eventful day had been wholly composed of his peninsular soldiers, of whom he had said, "I always thought, I could go anywhere and could do anything with that army," we should not have looked so anxiously for the arrival of the Prussians, nor would they have been up in time to have taken any share in the victory. Meanwhile the enemy's attack upon La Haye Sainte had been continued. They had, as related, dislodged the German riflemen from the orchard and garden, although a most determined resistance had been made by Major Baring. During the advance of Delaun's columns, the Duke observed the dreadful havoc made by the enemy's batteries and his front troops posted between the 2 highroads, and ordered them to retire behind the crest of the ridge for shelter. This movement was mistaken by Napoleon for one of retreat, and he immediately launched forward Kellerman's cuirassiers and carabineers to pick up our guns and stragglers, and press our rear. Shortly before this, His Grace advanced a reinforcement to La Haye Sainte, having observed that the enemy was about to make another attack. Upon the arrival of this reinforcement, Baring tried to recover the orchard, as well as the little garden on our side of the farm, which had fallen into the hands of the French. The Germans were advancing, when they observed some cuirassiers moving forward. Lord Edward Somerset, whose brigade was now in line immediately in the rear of this part of the position, had placed 2 officers on the ridge to give a signal of the enemy's advance, in order to time his charge. Upon the cuirassiers approaching the line of skirmishers in front of our right of the farm, these latter ran in upon Baring's troops, who were near the orchard, and threw them into confusion. They took to flight, but were overtaken, ridden down and sabred. While the cuirassiers were ascending the ridge, our artillery opened with grape and case shot, which laid many low, and disordered their ranks. They, however, pressed forward most gallantly. Somerset's line was now coming over the ridge, led by Uxbridge, and, at the moment our front squares fired into the cuirassiers, the 2 cavalries dashed into each other. The shock was terrific, the swords clashing upon the casques and cuirasses, so that, as Lord Edward Somerset humorously observed to me when he visited the field in June 1842, you might have fancied that it was so many tinkers at work. But it was of short duration. The British household cavalry soon cleared the ridge of the cuirassiers, although these made a most gallant resistance. They fled down the slope on both sides of La Haye Sainte, closely followed by the brigade, those on the allied left of the farm, by the 2nd Life Guards. It was in following up this charge, that part of this brigade mixed with Ponsonby's broken dragoons on the French position, and fell upon and sabred some of the enemy's infantry who had been assaulting La Haye Sainte. Part of the 1st Life Guards pursued some cuirassiers, till both became wedged in between the 2 high banks of the Genappe road, beyond the orchard of La Haye Sainte. Some of Ray's troops, who had advanced in support of Delaun's attack, fired down from these banks upon our Life Guards, who had to get back to our line as well as they could. Most of the King's Dragoon Guards had dashed over the road and were falling back to reform, but they lost many men and some officers, by the enemy's fire from the little garden of La Haye Sainte. In leading this charge, Lord Edward Somerset lost his cocked hat, and went to the charge bareheaded. On his return, whilst looking for his hat, a cannonball took off the flap of his coat and killed his horse. During the rest of the day he appeared in a Life Guard's helmet. Lambert's brigade was now brought forward to reinforce the remains of Kemp's division. Captain Seaborne, in the following spirited manner, concludes his narrative of the attack and defeat of the enemy, upon our left and centre, between 1:30 and 3 o'clock. Thus terminated one of the grandest scenes which distinguished the mighty drama, enacted on the ever-memorable plains of Waterloo, a scene presenting in bold relief genuine British valour, crowned with resplendent triumph, a scene which should be indelibly impressed upon the minds as well of living British warriors, as of their successors in ages yet unborn. Britons, before other scenes are disclosed to your view, take one retrospective glance at this glorious, this instructive spectacle. Let your imagination carry you to the rear of that celebrated position, and a little to the left of the Charleroi road. Behold, in the foreground on the right, a British line of cavalry advancing to the charge, exulting in the consciousness of its innate courage, indomitable spirit, and strength of arm. Whilst you are admiring the beautiful order and steadiness of their advance, your eyes are suddenly attracted by the glittering of a line of horsemen in burnished coats of mail, rising above the brow, and now crowning the summit of the ridge. They are the far-famed cuirassiers of France, led on by a Kellerman, gallant spirits, that have hitherto overcome the finest troops that could be brought against them, and have grown grey in glory. Trumpets sound the charge, in the next instant your ears catch the low thundering noises of their horses' hoofs, and your breathless excitement is wound to the highest pitch as the adverse lines dash together with a shock, which at the moment you expect must end in their mutual annihilation. Observe the British, how they seem to doubt for a second in what manner to deal with their opponents. Now they urge their powerful steeds into the intervals between the necks of those of the cuirassiers. Swords brandished high in air gleam fitfully in rapid succession throughout the lines, here clashing together, their clanging against helmet and cuirass, which ring under their redoubled strokes. See, his struggle is but a moment doubtful, the cuirassiers, seemingly encumbered by their coats of mail, are yielding to superior strength, dexterity and bravery combined, men and horses reel and stagger to the earth, gaps open out in their line, numbers are backing out, others are fairly turning round, their whole line now bends and breaks asunder into fragments, in the next moment they appear as if by a miracle, to be swept from off the crest of the position, and being closely and hotly pursued by the victors, the whole rushing down the other side of the ridge, are snatched from your view. Your attention is now irresistibly drawn to that part of the foreground immediately facing you, where you have barely time to catch sight of a line of British infantry just as it forces its way through the hedge that runs along the crest of the ridge, to charge a column advancing up the other side. At the moment the shouts that proclaim its triumph reach your ear, you are struck by the majestic advance, close to your left, of another line of British horsemen. These halt just under the brow of the ridge. In their left front your eye now also embraces a line of British infantry moving quickly up the steep, whilst at the same time you see the heads of 2 hostile columns issuing through the hedge, and crowning the ridge amidst shouts of Vive l'Empereur. The one nearest to you, finding no immediate opposition to its farther advance, is rapidly establishing itself on the height, the other is met by the advancing line of infantry. A struggle ensues, the farther column is concealed from your view by the smoke by which it is suddenly enshrouded. But at the very moment when doubts arise in your mind as to the result, the cavalry rushes forward, and passing through intervals opened out for it by the infantry, charges both those heads of columns, cutting them up, as it were, root and branch, and then bounding through the hedge, the whole disappears as if by magic. Now let your imagination, keeping pace with the intensity of feeling excited by such a scene, carry you up to the summit of the ridge. Behold at once a glorious spectacle spread out before you. The furious impetuosity of their onslaught overcomes all resistance. The terror-stricken masses, paralyzed by this sudden apparition of cavalry amongst them, have neither time nor resolution to form squares, and limit their defense to a feeble, hasty, straggling fire from their ill-cemented edges. A flight, commencing from the rearmost rank, is rapidly augmented by the outward scattering, occasioned by the continually increasing pressure upon the front. The entire slope is soon covered with the dispersed elements of the previously attacking force. Parties of infantry are hurrying over the brow of the ridge to aid others of the cavalry in securing their prisoners. 3,000 of these are swept to the rear, and 2 eagles are gloriously captured. From the momentary contemplation of these trophies, your eyes instinctively revert to the course of the victors, whom you now perceive in the middle distance of the view, a broken line of daring horsemen rushing up the opposite height. Their intoxicating triumph admits of no restraint. They heed not the trumpet's call to halt and rally, but, plunging wildly amidst the formidable line of batteries ranged along the French position, they commence sabering the gunners, stabbing the horses, and seem to clear the ground of every living being. But physical efforts, however powerfully developed and sustained, have their limit. Exhausted nature yields at length, and their fiery steeds, subdued not by force but by exhaustion, retire with lagging, faltering pace. You look in vain for a support, there is none, but your eye is suddenly caught by the fluttering of lance flags of a column of the enemy's cavalry approaching from the left, and you become nervously alive to the danger that awaits the valiant band of heroes, who are only now made sensible of the necessity of retiring to collect and rally their scattered numbers. Seeing no support ready to receive them, and becoming aware of the near approach of hostile cavalry, they make a last and desperate effort. Those who are best mounted, and whose horses are least blown, succeed in regaining the allied position unmolested. But a very considerable number are overtaken by the lancers, with whom they now contend under a fearful disadvantage in point of speed and order. But mark! A rescue is at hand. A gallant line of friendly cavalry throws itself against the right flank of the lancers, the farther portion or left of that line first dashing through and scattering an unsteady mass of infantry, the sole remaining column out of the entire attacking force that has yet kept together. The tide of destruction now sets in strongly against the lancers, their pursuit is checked, the heavy dragoons are relieved from the pressure. A melee ensues, but you are not kept long in suspense. For in another moment this newly arrived force, making good its way, succeeds in driving the lancers in confusion down to the foot of the valley. The arena in your front is speedily cleared of both friends and foes. The discharge of rockets which now attracts your attention appears like a display of fireworks in celebration of the glorious triumph. The affair has terminated. But stay to witness the concluding part of the scene. Observe the splendidly attired group entering upon the right, just above La Haye Sainte. It is headed by one whom you cannot for a moment mistake, the illustrious Wellington. Lord Uxbridge, returning from his brilliant charge, now joins the Duke, while the whole corps diplomatique et militaire express in the strongest terms their admiration of the grand military spectacle of which they have been spectators. Among them are representatives of nearly all the continental nations, so that this glorious triumph of your valiant countrymen may be said to have been achieved in the face of congregated Europe. Honor, imperishable honor, to every British soldier engaged in that never-to-be-forgotten fight. When Britain again puts forth her strength in battle, may her sovereign's guards inherit the same heroic spirit which animated those of George, Prince Regent, and inspire them with the desire to maintain, in all their pristine purity and freshness, the laurels transmitted to them from the field of Waterloo. And when the soldiers of the 3 United Kingdoms shall again be found fighting side by side against the common enemy, may they prove to the world that they have not degenerated from the men of the Union Brigade, who by their heroic deeds on that great day, so faithfully represented the military virtues of the British Empire. Several instances of extraordinary heroism were displayed by Lord Uxbridge, especially when, between 1 and 2 o'clock, he was leading on to charge the admiring men of the 2 heavy cavalry brigades. It was perhaps not less prudent than gallant to kindle a daring spirit in our cavalry, and rouse them to the highest pitch of emulation by the dashing valor of their chief. There was not a man amongst us who did not feel certain that Uxbridge would have led the charge, even if the whole French army had been moving in mass against him. Yet it is well known that there was one looking on, who did not wear a black stock nor carry a musket, but would have been better pleased if our chivalric leader had been a little more cautious to support, and more successful in keeping the cavalry well in hand. This concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Cotton's description of the battle? Please subscribe for more stories and leave a comment.